All right, so as Chris mentioned, today is actually a part 2 to a Salesforce webinar that we did earlier in the week. That one gave like an overview of what the Salesforce connector does and how to use it. This one will kind of deep dive into how to actually install it in your environment of Salesforce, as well as how to configure it. So on my screen here, I currently have Reltio pulled up. Because I just want to quickly show an example just in case someone didn't attend the other webinar. Basically, the main functionality of the connector is that it'll sync your data between the Salesforce instance that you may have and the Reltio instance. So in this example, if I go to my accounts in Salesforce, you see that I have New York Life here with some of the details here around New York Life, a phone number or website. And if I go to Reltio, I also have a New York Life here. And you can see that it has the same phone number, address. And if I quickly come here to sources view, I can show you, yes. So this one has a Salesforce crosswalk with this ID, this VAA3. If I come back to Salesforce, you'll see that this one also has the ID of VAA3. And basically the idea is, if I make a change here, that change will reflect on the other system and the same vice versa. So for example, if I come here and edit, okay, cool. Just want to make sure I was logged in as myself. If I come here and make an edit here and I change the name New York Life to New York Life Updated and then click save. Uh-oh, did I miss something? Oh, missed a required field. Sorry about that. There we go. I'll just pick one and click save. Oh, still missed something. Cool. There we go.
That's the beauty of these, Imran. Just never know what might go wrong. but I think everybody loves them. Yeah, exactly.
Yep. All right. So now on my Reltio side, I have it updated. And then within a little bit of time here, you'll see updated on this side as well. Yep, there we go. So then the name on Salesforce just changed to New York Life Updated. And so this is the main functionality of the connectors is to constantly monitor what's going on in Salesforce, what's going on in Reltio, and then performing the sync of the data behind the scenes. So now I can kind of get into how we actually get up and running with Salesforce. I have a couple of windows open because I'll be switching between the different users that I'm logged in as, going from the perspective of an administrator installing the application to the perspective of a user who's just creating an account or a contact within Salesforce. So there are a couple of prerequisites you should know about before you go off to the races and try to install. The first thing is on the Reltio side, we'll need a Reltio user that has the SFDC connector role as well as role API if you plan to use search before create. So this is a user that you can come and create in your own Reltio environment. Just go to user console, Reltio console, and then go to the user management page. I don't want to spend too much time actually explaining how to create a user, but the general idea is you just go to your account and create a user. For me, that'll be Reltio. And then the next thing is you'll want to make sure that streaming is enabled. And what I mean by this is streaming is the process of how Reltio sends event messages outbound to other systems. In our case, it'll be sending messages to Salesforce. And then the last one is that you want to make sure in your configuration that you've set up the source that you're going to use as the sourcing for the data that you get from Salesforce. As an example, I just put Salesforce here and SFDC. And in my use case, I'm currently using Salesforce, I believe, fully spelled out. Yep. Yes, I have Salesforce here as my source. This can be anything you want it to be as long as you're consistent between your Reltio configuration and your Salesforce connector configuration. But these two are just the most popular because it's kind of self-explanatory. On the Salesforce side, the things that we'll need is we'll need a user in Salesforce that can serve as the integration user. I guess I had a typo here. Integration user, there we go. But the intent of this user will be that it'll be a system admin who will kind of do all of the create, read, update, delete, CRUD operations in Salesforce. And we'll need to create this user and also get the security token. And you'll see why in just a moment here. The second thing we'll need to do as a prerequisite is add the Reltio URLs, the remote site setting. So I can show you that. There we go. So if you're in Salesforce, you go to setup, and then you can quickly find search for remote site settings. And then here you'll just need to add the Reltio URLs. And what this does is it just allows Salesforce to communicate with Reltio. And there are 4 that you need to add. The first one is the Reltio API. So this will be your Reltio environment. In my case, it's test USG. If you're in a production environment, this might be 361.reltio.com. And then the auth, this is the Reltio authentication. The connector, this is the actual Reltio connector URL. And then SBC is short for search before create. So this is, again, if you're planning to make use of the search before create functionality, you'll also add this one here. It's pretty easy to add. You just click new remote site and then type in a name and type in the URL and then click save. And then set up a custom domain. This is also a required step, but in 99% of cases, if you have Salesforce, it's probably already been set up for you. You just go to my domain here, and you'll notice that it uses the custom one. If it loads, it might be an issue with Salesforce Lightning. Okay, there we go. Yep. So in my case, I'm using Reltio cdev. But you'll see this, and if it's not the standard Salesforce login here, then you're good to go. And this is normally done by default when you first set up Salesforce as a system in your environment. So that I don't think you would need to worry about too much. And the last one is, this is more of a note than a prerequisite, but basically when doing the installation, whoever is doing it will actually need permission to install applications in the production environment. And this is a Salesforce quirk per se. If you go to a sandbox instance of Salesforce, it'll still ask you to log in with your production level credentials when you're trying to install an application. So yeah, that's the prereqs for what we need. And with that, we can go ahead and get started. So the way you install an application is pretty straightforward. Reltio's app is in the Salesforce Appexchange. So you come to Salesforce, go to Appexchange. That did not pop up. Okay. Let me refresh the page. It's like Appexchange is struggling there. App. Here we go. Appexchange Marketplace. And then I can search for Reltio. Click here. And then get it now. So this is the Reltio app. It's called Reltio Connected Customer Data for Salesforce. Same name as the webinar. But yeah, you click this Get It Now button at the bottom, and then it'll kind of walk you through the process of logging in, doing the installation. There's no settings for the installation. It's just simply you log in and then you select that you want to install it for this environment. And then it'll do the installation. Depending on where you're located, it might be really quick. And in other cases, if there's a lot of things in your Salesforce environment, it needs to do some more work to get it all installed. It'll let you know that they're going to Salesforce will send you an email once it's complete. So you can just wait for that to complete. In my case, I've already installed it, so I'm not going to reinstall. But once it's installed, you can leave the setup page of Salesforce. I'm going to switch over to the other window so it's easier. Oh, was that on the right one? Looks like that was on the right window to begin with. All right. But yeah, so you can leave the setup page, and if you come here to search, I just searched Reltio, and Reltio Connected Customer is the application, so I'll click that. And this will bring me to Reltio Control Panel. In my case, it's the third tab, but I know people can control what tabs show up here, so it might be the first one for you, it might be the last one. But the control panel is where we do the setup. here you'll see the welcome screen. When you do this the first time, this looks a little bit different in the sense that the background is blue and there's a status bar here that shows what step you're on. But the content of the screen is exactly the same. So you can follow along here. Basically, we're going to give it the tenant that we're connecting to. So this is my Reltio tenant ID, the environment, test USG for me. It might be dev or 361 or any of the other environments. This is my Reltio username. This is the one that I created here with the Reltio SFDC connector role. And then the password for that guy. So once I click verify, it'll try to connect to Reltio and then let me know that it was able to do it successfully. And then it'll take me to the next step. The next step is to actually provide the Salesforce user that we created here. And in my case, I've already connected a user, which if I can actually pull that up, maybe in like a separate tab. Yeah, here we go. So this is the user that I created. So I'd put that here. I'd enter its password. Just a second. And then the token. So the token is something that you're going to need to obtain for the user that you're using here. It's pretty easy to get one. If you don't already have it, I'm going to duplicate this tab so I can do it separately. But for your user that you're going to use here, you basically want to log in as the username that you use. So in my case, it's this Imran Momin at Reltio Sandbox. But basically, I'm already logged in as this user, so I don't need to log out. But I go to settings, and then I'll come here to search. Oh, it's actually already open. So my personal information, and then reset security token. And then you click the button reset, and it'll send you an email with the actual token that you can grab and then bring into your Salesforce. So let me wait for that email. Cool. All right. So now that I have my token, I'll just come here and put it in. In my case, this is login.salesforce. I know there are different variations of the Salesforce login URL, like test.salesforce. In some cases, you might have a custom login URL. So just make sure you're using the right URL here. Once you've got all that, you can click verify, and it'll try to make sure that this user is real and can log into Salesforce. Once that's completed, you get a success message. And then now we get to the fun part. So depending on your Reltio tenant setup, and if you have the organization entity type, the contact entity type, and then within Salesforce, if you're using the account object and the contact object, if you're using all of that standard out of the box, the connector will go ahead and attempt to create a version of the mapping for you. And if not, it'll just leave this box blank, and you'll get a message saying that it was not able to create the default mapping. So I can just click on this really quick to show you what that looks like. So this is the current mapping, and basically there's two tabs. The first one is Salesforce Reltio. This is everything on the left-hand side is what Salesforce has, and on the right-hand side is what I've mapped it to within my Reltio system. So if I hover over it, you can see the actual Reltio attribute URIs. And on the left side, you'll see the Salesforce API name for these fields. And then if I click on the next tab, it's basically the same thing, but opposite direction, so Reltio to Salesforce. So you can independently control which direction what data is getting synced. Unfortunately, you can't actually edit it here. So this is where we get into the meat of today's webinar. And so the way you edit it is actually you'll have to, reach into your handy dandy Postman. Let me grab a token. Cool. So what you want to do in Postman, share the collection here. So you have these API calls for your everyday use. But basically you want to make sure that you have the profile, which is this endpoint here. What the profile is the definition of the connector that you've just created. So in my case, it gave it this ID, and it has like some information around my Reltio side, authentication, my Salesforce side. But what I really want is just this ID here. Once I get that, I can go to my mapping, and basically the mapping will be the tenant and then the ID that I just grabbed. Let me back this out. and put this here, /mapping. So if I send this, it'll return the actual mapping JSON. And this is the JSON version of what I just showed you in the table in Salesforce. So now if I want to make changes to my mapping, what I can do is I can grab this, bring it over to my favorite JSON editor. Back that out. There we go. And so this is the JSON representation of this right here. And so the way we edit it is basically there are two components to it, just like there's two tabs here. You have the Salesforce to Reltio and then the Reltio to Salesforce. In your JSON, you're going to have the object definition at the top. So what this says is process merge true, meaning I'm allowing my system to handle merges. This can be true or false. Active just means that the current mapping is an active one. SFDC source, this is the where I mentioned here, ensuring that the Salesforce source is added to your MDM tenant. There we go. So this right here just should match whatever it is that you've selected on your Reltio configuration, whether that's Salesforce, SFDC, or something else that you want to call it within your organization. S object type, this is the Salesforce object that I'll be connecting to. And on the Reltio side, the Reltio object type is the Reltio entity that I'll be using. So in my case, I'm using the account as well as the organization entity type. And then now there are two groupings under here. There's one called to Salesforce and one called to Reltio. I'm going to close this one for now. So to Salesforce is basically that to Salesforce tab. And within it, you'll have attribute mappings where you'll have the name of the Salesforce field and the Reltio location where that value is located, the attribute URI. You'll kind of just go through and for every attribute that you have, you'll give it the Salesforce name as well as the Reltio attribute URI. This is using the Salesforce field API names. So it's not the labels that you see, but it is the full proper API name. And you kind of go through this exercise. And when I get down to phone, you'll notice that I have somewhat of a function here. There are a couple of functions that are supported here. And basically what they do is they allow you to add some kind of logic to your mapping. In my case, the reason I have some logic here is that within Reltio, you come over here, I only have a single phone attribute, and the type is what tells me if it's a phone number or a fax number. And so I needed to account for that logic in my Salesforce system where I have individual fields for phone and fax. So what I've done is I basically said, take the source of this attribute in Reltio, phone number, only if equals that phone attribute type is phone. And then I've done the same thing with type is fax for the fax number. And so basically what this is saying is it'll grab the number attribute from Reltio only if the type attribute is equal to fax or phone. And this is a way to kind of inject some logic to help you better map what's going back and forth between the two.
Hey, Imran.
Yep, go ahead.
There's a few questions. I don't know if you want me to do it now or should I wait?
Okay. Now it's fine.
Okay, so one of the questions is, are you going to be able to focus on how to set up nested attributes like phones, emails, and if we have many of them in BFO?
Sorry, what was that?
It's just answered.
Huh? Sorry, Georgie?
It was just answered.
Oh,
5 seconds ago.
Just answered my. All right, good. I think his questions were answered. Yep. Does the connector support connecting Reltio to multiple Salesforce instances?
Yes. If the question is if you have if a single Reltio tenant, yes, you can have multiple different instances of Salesforce connecting to the same one.
Okay. And then is active property be used to store alternate mappings if you want to temporarily use a different mapping?
That's actually a good question. I haven't tried to do that. I know there is a validation in the API itself that'll check to make sure you only have one instance of a mapping for any given object and Reltio entity. So I believe it'll catch it there before you're able to actually save the changes.
Okay.
Yep.
And then David Starnes just kind of says to chime in for Imran, yes, you can map a Salesforce object to Reltio entity. And then he says, we have currently mapped 3 different Salesforce objects to 2 entity types and 1 relationship type. So thanks for that, David. And then Bobby asks, do we have any drag and drop for the mappings? So instead of generating the JSON profile using Postman?
As of right now, no, this is the only way to do it. I think possibly in the future, there could be a way to do it more in a more user-friendly, UI-friendly approach. But for today, this is the only way to do it right now.
Okay. And then Gino, he's trying to stump you again. Was that you can only have 1 mapping per object or 1 active mapping per object?
So I believe the actual the rule is 1 Salesforce object type plus Salesforce record type. Those 2 together can only be mapped to a single entity in Reltio. And if you try to do it differently, it'll actually give you a error message. But if we're gutsy about it, we could try to do that right now and just see what happens.
It's pretty gutsy.
It shouldn't take more than a second to do, so I'm not too worried. But basically what I'll do here is I'll make one of them, let me just make this guy smaller. All right, I'll make one of them false and everything else will be the same between these 2. So let's try to take that to Postman and see what happens. I believe it catches it as an error because it sees two mapping instances with the same object type and same Reltio entity. But let's give it a shot. It's not JSON. Oh, did I mess up my JSON editing? Yeah, it sure did. Cool. Now it's supposed to.
Just thinking.
Yep. Hopefully he doesn't come back and say, hey, oh, your token's expired.
So while it's kind of processing, there's another question. Can you speak about how the callback from Reltio and bidirectional sync is prevented by flowing back to salesforce.com? I guess by user ID, but some more information regarding that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I can pull up the example here while that's loading. So basically what happens is when you create a record, either in Salesforce or in Reltio, if you create it on the Salesforce side, it's actually checking for the user that was used in the, let me scroll up here, in the setup. So in my case, if this user made any changes in Salesforce, the connector will ignore it until that record was touched by someone else. Because the connector believes that, hey, I was the last one to touch it, meaning there's no updates for me to look at now until someone else has come in and made a change. So it uses the username for Salesforce Reltio. On the Reltio side, it does something similar, but instead of using your personal username, it's actually using the Salesforce connector username, this sfdc.connector, which is a Reltio platform user. This is a user that no one really has access to. But if the connector sees that this is the record, this is the user on record as the last update, it'll ignore that record until someone else has touched it. And so it's kind of tracking that on both sides and making sure that it doesn't end up in like somewhat of a loop.
Cool. Thank you.
It's like this is still sending.
It was a bold move, but you thought it'd only take a second. But there you go.
Yep. Okay, cool. There we go. Yeah. So it did give me an error saying the duplicate object found between the Salesforce object and the entity type. So even if you have active true or false, really doesn't matter. As long as the 2 objects are the same, it won't let you save that. So answer confirmed.
Cool. I think that's all the questions for now. Thanks, Imran.
Cool. So we're looking at the mapping. Let's scroll back up to where it was. Yep. So we just talked about phone and fax. And then the same thing for address. And you kind of just go through this step by step for each of the attributes that you need in your environment. In my example, it's pretty basic. I just have the shipping address, phone number, fax number, website, name. But you can get more complicated if you have additional attributes. In the to Salesforce section, even if you have nested attributes, they are just mapped as a single line. So you just put the full URI of the attribute that you're trying to get. In my case, address line 1 is nested under addresses, and then map that to the relevant Salesforce object. And the reason for this is Salesforce is pretty flat in terms of its data model structure, whereas Reltio has all of these concepts like a nested or a reference, where you can be a little bit more multi-dimensional with how the data is stored. But so that's the to Salesforce side. The next part of the mapping is the to Reltio. Scroll too much. Is the to Reltio. There's something called related objects, but I'll get to that in a little bit. To Reltio, same idea, attributes mapping. So this is the reverse, right? So in this case, you'll have the Reltio URI and the name of the Salesforce field that we want to map to that. So for the most part, it's pretty much the same logic here. You'll just do the Salesforce field and the Reltio URI. When we get to nested, it does get a little bit different. So if you look at this example here, phone is a nested attribute. So I put the parent of the nest, phone here, followed by a value tag, and then another set of mappings. And this second set of mappings will be all of the sub attributes that belong to that phone nest. In my case, I'm using the phone number as the value of the Salesforce field phone. And then for the phone type, because Salesforce has a hard-coded field called phone and a hard-coded field called fax, what I've done is, as it comes to Reltio, I've just said, in the first case, when I'm grabbing the phone field, default the type to the actual hard-coded value phone. And I'm not sure if it shows up in the screen share or if it's a little blurry, but basically what I have here is equals quotation, single quote, phone, and then end single quote. So basically I'm using a function to say, this should always just be hard-coded to phone. And then likewise down here for fax, doing the same thing and hard-coding it to fax. And so this kind of breaks out that flat model from Salesforce where you have a phone and a fax field to the nested approach that Reltio has, where there's a single phone nested attribute. And within that, you could have the different types of phone or fax, depending on the scenario. And then address, again, same thing. I know on Salesforce, there's actually something called a compound field, and that's what shipping address is by default. If that's how your addresses are set up, you just include that compound field name here when you create your address. But the rest of the attribute mapping for all the sub attributes is essentially the same. So that's the to Reltio side. There's some more down here for search before create, which this is not search before create. This is the active false one that I put in. Sorry, let me remove that guy. Oh, okay, so I don't have the search before create example in this mapping. Yeah, so that's how the mapping works. And essentially, once you've kind of figured out exactly how you want it to look, you can just grab it and post it back to the API. So if I go back to Postman, remove that and post it, and click send. Hopefully the send works a bit faster. Yep. So it's saying that the mapping's been updated, and I can confirm that it's updated by going back to Salesforce, coming back to the screen that I was at, and I'll press the sync config button. This will essentially force it to go grab the latest mapping, and I'll get a success message saying all triggers are up to date and Reltio configuration has been done. If you don't get the triggers message, you can go to trigger settings and force it to generate triggers, and it'll be able to do it. And if not, it may be because you might have some other Apex code in your Salesforce environment that's actually controlling the triggers. And in that case, it'll print out a default trigger that you can quickly copy. And then you can kind of go into your settings and actually manually add in the triggers so that the Reltio connector can work. But once you click the sync config button, if you open this, it'll reflect the most recent changes that it has in the sync table once it loads. And so that way you can always verify that, hey, the changes that I just posted here does that match what I'm seeing here on the screen? And if it doesn't, it might just be that your mapping is not maybe what you, or maybe you mismatched something, or whatever the case is. But so yeah, you always want to make sure that this screen is reflecting exactly what you posted back into your JSON.
So-
Once you've done the map, is there a question?
Well, there's just kind of a statement. Maybe you can
Okay.
verify it. David says, I believe you have to manually install the triggers to the Salesforce.com production environment.
I don't think that's always true, but I think it's heavily dependent on the model, the data model in your Salesforce, as well as if you have other triggers in place. So if you're playing with a vanilla version of Salesforce, it should do it automatically. But again, if it doesn't, then you can click generate triggers. It'll give you the error message and also the default Reltio trigger, which you can then kind of copy paste and then go into setup and actually add them yourself. So either way, it accomplishes the same function. It's just one is kind of automatic and the other one, you'll kind of have to go do it yourself. So like I come down to triggers, and this is the one that got created for me. But if it didn't, I would just kind of come in and basically this is the trigger that was set. I would basically create one that has the same content, and then I'd be good to go.
Thanks, Imran. And I think it's probably rare that people have a vanilla Salesforce instance.
Right.
So,
You're probably right. In which case you just go here and kind of create your own.
yeah.
Yep.
Thanks.
All right. So once that's done and you got the mapping in here, there is one more step you have to do before you're up and running. So once that's completed, you do have to do what is called registration. So registration is just registering your tenant and your Salesforce profile with the Reltio Connector API. It's a straightforward API, just registration and then your tenant ID and then that Salesforce profile ID. You just get those three and then you post it. In my case, because I've already installed it, it should already show, yep, already tells me that this one's already been registered. But once I've got the registration, then I'm good. That means that I can go and check and make sure that everything's syncing. And if you want that final confirmation that you've set it all up, there is a status API you can get, which will show you your tenant details. In my case, because I have access to a ton of tenants, I see a ton of tenants here. I'm just going to quickly search for mine. There we go. But you only get the ones that you have access to here. So you can kind of just make sure sync is enabled, all the messages say success. Sync is enabled on the Salesforce side. It looks like I have 2 failed records. I'm assuming it's related to mapping. And then the SQS is success. Event store looks good. So this is just confirmation that, okay, I've set up everything and it's all there. And now I can start syncing data back and forth between Reltio and Salesforce. A couple other things I did want to point out here is with the mapping. So I mentioned related objects, which I said I'd come back to. Related objects is essentially a case where you have, I think it was in one of the messages in the chat that said something about multiple Salesforce objects being mapped to a single entity in Reltio. The way that would work is, let's say I had the organization entity in my Reltio, and then I had the account object, but then within Salesforce, oops, clicked too many times. There we go. My account object may be related to 5 other objects in the world of Salesforce. And so I would need to add some items here to my related objects. And the way I would do that is I would essentially come down here to related objects and I'd add an additional mapping for those other objects that I may have. A good example is, excuse me, a good example is that there's a lot of cases where we end up with addresses being a separate object. I've seen this on multiple customers where you'll have an account object in Salesforce and you'll have separately an address object, and there'll be a relationship in Salesforce between the address and the account. And sorry, I'm just copy pasting here, so I don't have to type it all out. But basically, I would insert something like this. I'm gonna remove that because that's not, there we go. And basically what this is doing is it's saying whenever I create an account, also check for the related objects that this account may have. And in this case, I'm saying that this guy is related to an object called address VODC. And the nested attribute on the Reltio side that I want this to map to is addresses. And then record type ID, this is again, if you have a record type ID set up for address VOC, you can add it. If you don't, you can basically skip that. And then you can add in the attribute mapping. The attribute mapping follows the same logic as it did up here. So there's no difference. It's just with this process, you've now allowed both the address VOC object and the account object to sync to the organization entity in Reltio. And so that's kind of what this related objects function really does. And so we've seen cases where, you know, people may have like a parent account, or you might have a account grouping or some other type of object in Salesforce, like a custom object. And you want to make sure that those get synced across. You add them here as the related objects. Similarly, on the Reltio side, on the to Reltio side, sorry, I'm scrolling. I'm a happy scroller. There's a thing called relations. This is very similar to the related objects, except it doesn't take a full attribute mapping. What it really does is it just says, hey, I have a relationship between like a contact and its parent account is a good example. And I don't need to necessarily recreate the account because I'm mapping the account up here already. So instead, what I might have is I might have another set of mappings like this for contact. Just gonna change the name here, right? And this one would be contact, and maybe I have it mapped to my individual. I think I spelled that wrong. There we go. Cool. So, right, like I have a separate set of mappings for my contact and a separate set of mappings for my account. So now let's say I have the contact is related to the accounts, but it's not a object of the account. In Reltio, these are still two separate entities that need to be related together. I'd come to my relations and I'd essentially add the relationships that I need to create within the between this and another object. Sorry, again, I'm just copy pasting, so I don't have to type it all out. There we go. Cool. Has contact. So what I just added here is essentially some JSON to tell the mapping that, hey, I have this relationship in Reltio called has contact. I want to create this relationship between contact and some other object that's in my mapping. I don't have to tell it what object, because when Salesforce sends it, Salesforce will tell Reltio, hey, contact has a relationship to account. If it's on the basis of this account ID field, then create a has contact relationship. If it's on the basis of another SFDC field, it'll ignore it because I haven't specified it as part of my relations yet. So, you know, you might have an account ID, or a common one I think that I've seen in a lot of places is a parent ID. So just depending on what your use case is, you can add that here. So that's what the relationships do.
Cool. Imran, just quickly, a statement and kind of that I like a lot, and maybe you can help guide us. So one of the things that, you know, somebody asked was, you know, are there any of those scripts on Community? And the answer is today, no, there's not. But I don't know if anything exists on the documentation site, you know, but that could be something that we kind of start doing, is maybe pushing out some of these scripts, you know, because it'd be extremely easy to cut and paste and that, or copy and paste kind of stuff, you know.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there are a few examples actually on the documentation, but you're absolutely right. It would be nice to just have like a fully created mapping that you could quickly just grab and get running with. So I think that would be helpful. Actually, sorry, I'm like jumping to the topic. I know I probably shouldn't do that, but
no, that's good. People asked, and you know,
yep.
So it does exist to some degree.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the same example that I just copy pasted from, but there are examples here. We can probably vet out if there's more that we could add to it, or if there's some things that are missing. Yep.
Great. And what I'll do is, once I get this recorded, or once I get this published out, I could post a link directly to the docs on where some of that is. Does that help, David? A little bit, hopefully. So, all right, keep going.
Cool. So that covers most of what I wanted to talk about, like with the mapping. So you edit your JSON once you got it all ready and how you want it. You can post it to the tenant, and then you wrong tab. Come over here. You do the sync config. Once the sync config is complete and you've got the success messages, at this point you're good to go. Reltio, whenever it gets updates, will start sending them to Salesforce based on the logic that was defined in your mapping. And then same thing with Salesforce, it will start sending updates to Reltio. When Salesforce generates updates, Salesforce doesn't have the concept of like a SQS streaming for Reltio. And so basically what it'll do is it'll capture them in a temp table, which is under the data restore tab. So if you ever want to kind of see what was getting synced, you come here and look. In my case, it looks like I had 2 delete operations. Both of them failed. Not found. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I couldn't find the crosswalk to delete, which makes sense because I actually manually deleted these records earlier in the week, which is probably why I couldn't find them. But basically, this table here will capture all of the pending updates, and it'll sync them at a periodic time period. If you don't want to wait it out and you just made a change and you just want that change to go over right away, you can come here and actually click the run sync button, and that'll force the sync process to pick up everything in this table immediately and try to process it. The second thing is, if you have failures, there's actually a special button just for resyncing those. Sync IDs is like a specific ID that you want to sync over. If there's like a very specific record that you're looking at, so you just paste in the IDs here. I believe this is comma separated, so you can have like 1, 2, 3, so forth. And that'll add it to the sync queue. And then the last one is remove sync events. So this one, you can select to just remove the failed events from the table, so which I just did. So if I refresh the table, there's nothing to display here. But now if I go to my other user and let's say I edit something, I'll just edit the name again, just because it's easier. Updated again, and then click save. Now I come back over here and I click refresh. I should see, yep. So the thing that I just updated created a new entry here. And now when this periodic sync runs, it'll grab this and sync it over to Reltio. The default is, I believe, 5 minutes. And you can check that by getting the profile API that I had earlier. Pull time. In my case, it's 300 seconds, which is 5 minutes. You can shorten this down, so you could have this be maybe 30 seconds. So every 30 seconds, your Salesforce connector will go look for updates in Salesforce. You could have it be a minute. It's just a balance of performance to how much of a frequency you expect things to change within Salesforce. Some people don't care and they just have it out at like 600 seconds. Others have it at like 15 seconds. If you have it at 15 seconds, just know that it's constantly checking. So everything that can go through essentially will go through. And that could end up creating like a long line in the queue of things that need to be processed. That's what this pull time number controls. And if I don't want to wait out that pull time number, in my case, it looks like it automatically ran. I didn't have to do anything. I would just click this run sync and it would force it to run to the other side. So if I come here and refresh the page, I should see updated again as the name. Yep. So the name changed there because it must have hit that 5-minute pull time while I was just talking about it. But the way you do that is essentially you can grab this entire payload. You can go to create profile. And you kind of just paste it in. don't need that extra stuff at the top and bottom. Yep. And then the API is basically going to be your tenant ID followed by your SFDC profile ID. I think I had it say the SFDC profile. Yep. And then you could change this here, right? So I can change this to like 50 if I wanted to, or 60 is a better number. So that'd be 60. So that'd be 1 minute as the pull time. And then I could save that. I'm leaving mine as 5 minutes just because I'm actually like actively testing something for a client here in my sandbox. So I don't want to change it, but that's what we control at the same time. I don't think I have anything else unless there's any other questions, but we basically covered the gist of how you get up and running with the connector.
Ron, there's no other questions. This is really great. There was some questions asked. That was good stuff. Unless there are no other questions, I think we're good to go. So we do have one more webinar coming up, and that will be next week. So take a look at the go to community.reltio.com and look at the event, RSVP if you haven't had a chance. If you have other questions about the Salesforce connector, please go to community.reltio.com, ask your question, and I'll make sure that Imran or even Michael will help answer that question. Imran, thank you so much. It's awesome. Bobby says this is a great presentation. Thanks so much. It's very helpful. So thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you next week.
Awesome. Thanks everybody.
Take care.